Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. First of all, I have to thank to the Polanyi Institute of Political Economy to invite us to contribute to this conversation in the format of a roundtable. My name is Brigitte Aulenbacher from the Johannes Kepler University in Austria, Linz, and Vice President of the International Karl Polanyi Society. It is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists and discussions of this roundtable discussion to you. And first, I have to apologize Klaus Dörre, because he is not able to join the conference. Also, he would have loved to be here. So I introduce first, and in the alphabetical order, Margaret Abraham. Margaret Abraham is professor of sociology of the Hofstra University, New York, USA. And she is the past president of the International Sociological Association. Her research areas are gender studies, migration, immigration studies, domestic violence, farmer suicides protests, and other social protest movements. She combines perspective from the global North and the global South, and her own sociological approach is a contextual global public sociology, and she focuses on the topic of social justice. Very welcome, Maggie. Then the next in alphabetical order is Michael Burawoy. He is professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the past president of the International Sociological Association. Maggie has been the successor of Michael in this position. He is most renowned as a public sociologist, and his research areas are labor studies, the marketization of the universities, social theory and the theory of society. He has worked on Marx, Gramsci, Polanyi, Bourdieu. His own analysis of the capitalist development points out that we are witnessing a third wave marketization after Polanyi. Very welcome. And last but not least, I welcome Maria Markantonatou. Maria is associate professor at the University of the Aegean and works in political sociology. She has been a fellow at the Max Planck Institute and at the Kolleg Postwachstumsgesellschaften in Germany. She's an expert in research on Polanyi's works and life, and has written about his approach with focus on the economy, the state, and democracy. She analyzes the crisis in Southern Europe and Greece through the lenses of Karl Polanyi. So, we have 3 experts in this plenary who will discuss about the developments before, in, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. And we agreed that this plenary will work as a round table discussion about 3 periods. One is the period before the pandemic broke out. The next one is the period in the pandemic we are witnessing today. And the last one is the period when we may think about times after the pandemic. We want to start with inputs in these 3 rounds, and we invite everybody to contribute to our discussion. This is possible by Q and answers. So it's possible to put your comments, to put your questions, and to contribute to the discussion, and we will read them. First, we start with a round of inputs, 3 inputs of our experts and a common discussion. And the first round is the period from the finance to the COVID-19 crisis. In 2007 to 2009, it seemed for a historical moment that the crisis of finance could be considered to be the end, or at least a break with the market fundamentalism of the previous decades. A lot of progressive protest movements emerged, struggling against the effects of the finance market-driven dynamics and their effects on the society. Today, we have to realize that the optimistic scenario has been wrong if we have a look on the consolidation of capitalism, the influence of right-wing movements and parties, and many more things. In this first round, I like to ask our 3 experts to outline the most important developments of the last decade before the pandemic broke out, and to tell us in how far the pandemic has to be seen as a rupture concerning the ecological, economic, social, and political development. And the first who will start is Michael.
Hey. All right. Thank you very much, Brigitte, and thank you to the Karl Polanyi Institute for so courageously putting on a remote conference like this. Quite challenging, I know. Yes, and thanks, Brigitte, for inviting me to be on this panel, and I'm delighted to join Maria and Margaret, friends, colleagues, and fellow sort of Polanyans. And I'm going to say a few remarks, 5 minutes remarks of a more general character, not exactly following Brigitte's orders, but I think they're comments that are sort of derived from comments I've seen by 2 colleagues on the panel. So I think there are 4 Polanyi type questions I just want to raise for the present conjuncture. What are the peculiarities of marketization as we know it today? What's the nature of counter movements today? The relationship between state and society, and the global character of counter movements. And I'm going to argue, I'm going to assert really that you can't look at these questions without some sort of historical perspective. And I'm going to read out, because it's a webinar, and webinars I have to read out, I'm afraid, to make quite sure I confine myself to my 5 minutes. I can't see an audience, so that's good. All right, so let me say this. Polanyi, let me begin. Polanyi famously failed to anticipate another round of market fundamentalism after he died, what we now call neoliberalism, what I call third wave marketization. The question is this: in Polanyian terms, what is peculiar to this wave of marketization that we witness today, that we are part of today? Here I would suggest that we play with Polanyi's ideas of fictitious commodities, labor, nature, money, and we might add knowledge. And I would suggest that each wave of marketization, and I believe there have been 3, each wave of marketization can be seen as a particular articulation of the commodification of fictitious commodities, that we have to look at the relationship amongst these fictitious commodities as they get commodified to understand these different waves. That's my point number 1. Point number 2. Polanyi is famous for linking marketization to counter movements, and moreover arguing that these counter movements can assume an authoritarian or a more democratic character. That is how he saw the New Deal, Stalinism, and fascism. It raises the question, I don't believe he answered, why we get one reaction rather than another. it is just a story of, perhaps it's just a story of institutional legacies? Or is it actually a story of counter movements reacting against one another? In the present, for example, why does the ascendancy of progressive movements after 2010, as Brigitte has pointed to, why do these movements after 2010 turn into reactionary movements starting already in 2013? Why has the pandemic given rise to the progressive movement of the Biden administration, so far at any rate, when it could so easily have given rise to a more anti-state, pro-capital response of Trump, if he had won? It's almost as if the counter movement is on a knife edge. It can easily take different directions. Indeed, Ira Katznelson, in his classic Fear Itself, suggests that the New Deal might itself have taken a more fascist direction. Anyway, I think Maria will have a lot to say about that question. Third question of counter movements raises the question of the relationship between the state and society. Polanyi's scheme for the 19th century is of a society as a reaction to the market or to marketization. There's no real theorization of the state here at all. In the 20th century, Polanyi argues that there is a tension between democracy and capitalism, and here it's not clear why one or the other wins out. But in his accounts, society disappears actually from the story. So different from the 19th century. And indeed, the opposite of Antonio Gramsci's analysis of the same phenomena. All of which is to affirm what others have noted. Polanyi has an undeveloped theory of society and its relationship to the state. Indeed, he often reduces the one to the other. One of the most important developments, especially under Trump, was the polarization within the US of the civil society. That cannot be understood, I would argue, without reference to the state. Inasmuch as Polanyi does focus on society's reaction to the market, therefore, we need Gramsci to help us understand the relationship of society to the state. So finally, if we are going to talk about counter movements, then we should not only see them in terms of countering specific commodifications of fictitious commodities, we should also see them in terms of their scale. In Polanyi's scheme, the reaction to first wave marketization in Britain in the 19th century was, in his view, a local one, a labor movement, whereas in the 20th century, reaction to second wave marketization was at the local, but also, as we've seen, at the state level. Today, it seems to me that in face of global finance, that's the commodification of money, in the face of climate change, the commodification of nature, in the face of corporate giants who are commodifying knowledge, in the face of rising numbers of refugees due to the commodification, or as I would say, ex-commodification of labor, not to mention the pandemic itself and the commodification of healthcare, in the face of all these global commodifications, we clearly need a global counter-movement as well as local and national reactions. And the question is, what form could this possibly take? And thinking globally, we have to recognize that Polanyi has a Eurocentric view of the world, and today that just won't wash, as I think Margaret will agree with me. Anyway, those are my comments, opening comments.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Maggie, you may give your contribution, yes?
First of all, thank you, Brigitte, for organizing this session. Thank you to the Karl Polanyi Institute. I'm pleased to be here with my fellow panelists, Michael and Maria. And I want to start by saying that Michael raises some issues here that stimulate a discussion for our understanding of the contemporary period. As you, Brigitte, noted in your description, and I quote, 2007 to 2009 and the subsequent austerity schemes gave rise to social protest movements criticizing and struggling against the effects of market fundamentalism and neoliberalism and envisioning emancipatory ideas of society, unquote. Today, drawing on the work of Polanyi, we can consider some similarities with the 2000-2009 crisis and the COVID-19 crisis. And I would say that is the ongoing consolidation of capital, as well as counter movements that are drawing attention to increased entrenched inequalities and injustices that require structural transformation. I'm going to take one point in this discussion. I think Michael has given us a broader perspective. In 2011, inspired by the revolts in Egypt and Tunisia, the Occupy Wall Street movement drew attention to new forms of globalization and to the widening economic inequalities in the US. People, especially young people, protested the egregious appropriation accumulation of wealth by banks and corporations at a time when significant numbers of Americans had become poorer. The OWS movement was a response to growing inequalities and erosion of economic opportunities and the decline of democracies. It was a response to the deepening divides in the United States, stemming from the expanding corporate power, concentration of wealth in the hands of the 1%, with little or no economic or opportunities, no safety nets for the remaining 99. It was an expression of moral indignation at the levels of corporate corruption, corporate manipulation of government, and the lack of concern for the ordinary person's ability to earn a decent livelihood. It was a protester's objection to the Wall Street bailouts in 2008 that allowed the banks to enjoy huge profits, protected them from losses with claims that these corporations were, I quote, too big to fail, and yet had left the average American bearing the pain of high unemployment, and job security. The OWS movement represented the frustration of people from high unemployment rates, from families dispossessed from foreclosures of their homes stemming from unregulated and exploitative lending practices by banks, and from bearing the high costs of education without the possibility of obtaining a suitable job. The illegal foreclosures, bailouts of corporations with taxpayer monies, while corporate executives continued to get exorbitant bonuses, the inequity and discrimination in the workplace based on age, the color of one's skin, sex, gender, identity, and sexual orientation, poor labor conditions, erosion of employee rights to negotiate for better pay and safer working conditions. The burdens for students from debts incurred for education, lack of affordable healthcare, the use of military and police force to limit the freedom of the press, corporate corruption and corporate greed, environmental abuse by corporations, corporate control of the media and information flows, increasing privatization, and the ways that corporations and governments have perpetuated colonialism at home and abroad, including the role of government involved in the torture and murder of innocent civilians. It's interesting, I live in New York. At the time, the OWS movement and the popular movements across the globe, such as the Arab Spring and the Indignados, pushed us to consider ways to achieve greater equality and rethink what is and can be the nature of democratization in the 21st century. Alas, we now realize that the optimistic scenario did not pan out, and in fact witnessed in many ways the consolidation of capitalism and the rise of the influence of right-wing movements and parties. And Michael has mentioned this when he started. The last decade, especially with Trump's election, also witnessed violence being used against vulnerable populations of the sections of the population who are identified by the state in one way or another as being the other. It had become a form of targeting and controlling difficult or marginalized groups in many countries, often through some form of state collusion. And this kind of comes to our discussion of state and society. In 2020, the global pandemic once again has been marked by a period of uncertainty and fear. It has also laid bare the widening economic and social inequalities and the deepening disparities. We have seen increased pandemic-related stresses and hardships, including food insecurity, unemployment, fear and anxiety, frustration, depression, alienation, and grief. We have seen the disproportionate burdens encountered and experienced by certain sectors and groups based, for example, on the intersections of race, gender, class, and immigrant status. We have seen the power of corporate capital and the struggles of labor. Now, while the financial markets saw some initial volatility due to the uncertainty of the pandemic overall, these markets seem to have done very, very well. In fact, some sectors, such as the financial sector, Wall Street, technology, corporations such as Google, Apple, online retail services such as Amazon, streaming services, Netflix, did exceedingly well. On the one hand, small businesses incurred losses, jobs were lost. Sorry, not on one hand, on the other hand, small businesses incurred losses, jobs were lost. A great number of women were losing jobs or had to leave their jobs to take care of elderly and children. High rates of unemployment, homelessness were accompanied by an increased burden on those they deemed as essential workers, who previously were never seen as essential. Many of them, of course, these essential workers, were people of color, many engaged in care work, working in hospitals, elder care facilities, farms, grocery stores, and service industries. Since March 2020, reports also show that the lockdowns and various restrictions put in place have increased and intensified gender-based violence, especially violence against women and children. One might say that overall, the conditions created by the coronavirus reduce many forms of institutional and social support. Now, while the state provided coronavirus aid package to provide emergency relief across the American economy, big corporations were also the beneficiaries among the various categories, and actually they received a substantial support. However, to draw upon Polanyi's work, one can say that the pandemic also witnessed counter movements like the Black Lives Matter that are interrogating the structures and institutions and seeking equality and justice. These counter movements are challenging us to look at issues of equality and justice, as well as the complacency and complicity in various forms of systemic exclusion and injustice, and are working through such counter movements to seek societal transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third in our round is Maria.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, for organizing this panel. And so to Brigitte's question, if we were to emphasize the most important consequences of the financial crisis management of the last decade, perhaps we could note first the shifting of the burden and the blame to working classes rather than the economic elites, and second, the unprecedented insistence, at least in the Eurozone, on austerity, despite broad social discontent and effort which in Polanyian terms meant to separate economy from democracy, from political opponents, and even disturbing political outcomes such as referenda and national elections. And an institutional innovation of the last decade has been also the European Stability Mechanism for countries in need, namely a mechanism to get loans on the condition of austerity and privatization, as it happens with Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and other countries. There was also the deepening of fiscal discipline through more EU surveillance of national budgets, updates of the fiscal compact, the creation of automatic mechanisms of punishment in case of deviations from budget discipline, and so on. And of course, counter movements in the sense of Polanyi were born out of the crisis, from Syriza, Podemos, the Occupy, the Indignados, and so on. And they have indeed put their stamp in the history of resistance to the crisis, but without finally causing a rupture with a global neoliberalism. So the pandemic today is a new problem, of course, but there are some alarming similarities with 2010. For example, before imposing austerity in 2010, states had offered bailout packages to banks, and now in the COVID pandemic, according to the president of the Eurogroup, Pascal Donohoe, state aid in the US and Europe has been double than that of the 2008 financial crisis. For their pandemic losses, millions were offered to airline companies such as Lufthansa, Air France, and Alitalia, much less money to smaller businesses, and much less in benefits to people who suddenly lost their jobs. The former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, had stated 10 years ago, he would do whatever it takes, as he said, for the Eurozone's stability. And now in the pandemic, Emmanuel Macron has stated that European money should compensate for the lockdown of capitalism, whatever the cost, as he said. So we seem to move from Draghi's whatever it takes approach to Macron's whatever the cost approach. In 2010, because of the bailout packages to banks, many analysts thought the crisis was being resolved by Keynesian means, and there were voices that we are all Keynesian now, and neoliberalism, after many decades of thriving since the 80s, was finally declared to be dead. And now in the pandemic crisis, once again, we read that state responses are Keynesian because of the increases in government spending, but we should be careful here, since 2010 showed it was more of a Keynesianism for the rich. It would be problematic to declare neoliberalism again dead. Also, as a response to the pandemic, came already last year such programs as the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program of the ECB to bring down Italian sovereign bond spreads. Then came the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility and the plan Next Generation EU, which promises millions of euros, loans and grants for investments at the fields named green transition and digital transformation. The COVID hit states get that money only if the Commission approves the plans they will have to submit, and so-called reforms dictated by the Commission. Of course, countries like Greece know very well what EU reforms mean, and so in one of the world's most indebted countries, to get new loans could only mean a new austerity round. But also for other countries, the question is who pays the cost and how for these bailouts. For instance, in a very recent text by the European Commission, there is the recommendation on how to get this money to review civil service regulations to allow more flexible working conditions. So what exactly means flexible conditions, and this flexibility comes again and again, and when does it ever stop? Finally, in the previous years, low interest rates in the US and the Eurozone, due to such programs as the quantitative easing, resulted into large companies accumulating debt, and loans to specific states from the European Stability Mechanism have increased state debt too. So with the experience of the last decade, it is likely that the cost of these huge amounts of debt, together with new COVID debt, will be shifted once again to the society, to the detriment of social income and welfare services. And maybe it is not surprising that some governments are already passing changes to labor laws and trying to institutionalize precarization through, again, the individualization of contracts, expansion of working hours, and so on, sometimes including teleworking and digital labor. So to come to Brigitte's question, rupture with neoliberalism seems again hard to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this input. And I would like to ask you in the first round to respond to each other. I think there are a lot of common issues in these inputs, and perhaps it's a chance to deepen some of the aspects. And I invite the audience to contribute to questions and answers, please. So who want to be the first to give response to each other?
I'm happy to just, I just want to, I think that these two presentations that came after me raise a number of interesting questions. I don't know if I've got any answers. In fact, the more I think about the present conjuncture, the fewer answers I seem to have about what's going to happen. So I like Maria's sort of, well, end of neoliberalism. We've said that too many times. So, I mean, I think that one question I had was, so these counter movements of Polanyi seem to me to be a response to commodification. and particularly the commodification of labor, particularly in the 19th century, and the commodification of Nate and so on, commodification. But when I hear what you were saying, Margaret, is that you had a whole series of other things that were sort of giving rise to counter movements. You talked a lot about inequality and exclusion and justice, and on the one hand, but you did also talk about precaritization. So I'm wondering if we can sort of figure out what is it that makes for a social movement. That seems to really a sort of a question that Polanyi raises, because he's got a definite view about this, and it's really sort of an anti-Marx view. It's an anti-inequality argument. So it's a commodification, that the experience of commodification is what actually drives people to perhaps organize. I mean, I got other questions, but that's one of them. I suppose the other, and let me just say the relation between capitalism and democracy is obviously a question, Maria, that you're raising, which I found, so one that Polanyi addresses. He seems to think they're in tension. I think they're not necessarily so. Why are the Keynesian responses so different in the two periods? That's bloody interesting. I mean, what happened? Did Biden learn from Obama, so to speak? Has it been a learning process, or is it something to do with the pandemic? I think that's a fascinating question. Yeah, and then there's also this issue of the periphery of the EU. But yes, anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm sorry, I've only got questions rather than answers.
Michael, can I include a question from the audience to you? Thank you for these very insightful reflections. I wondered if Michael could elaborate on the class dynamics of the current wave of marketization, commodification, and how this influences contemporary counter-movements activity.
I'll have to think about that.
It's from Geoff Godwin. Okay, you think about it and give the answer later?
Yeah, I will. I think that my colleagues should talk, and I'll think about how to answer that question.
Okay, then I would like to include two questions for Maria. Maria, a rupture with neoliberalism and austerity is happening in spite of the weakness of left and right, because it doesn't work. Will we learn in time supporting redistribution and stability from Francisco Bozzano Barnes and from Jerome Warren? Maria, talking about issues of austerity and stability. What do you think, going back to Keynes' suggestion during Bretton Woods, about establishing an international monetary fund, particular Keynes' vision of pushing for a global balance by punishing debtor countries as well as surplus countries, was never realized. Keynes was aware that each deficit is a surplus, but sadly political power seems to rest with the surplus countries like Germany, not with debtor countries like Greece. I would like to ask you to include the questions in our round of answering.
Of Francisco, I don't think that neoliberalism is coming to an end. It seems that you imply that is, that there is a rupture with neoliberalism, but I don't think that this is the case. I follow Polanyi in that regard, who has shown us that the state has to take some protectionist measures sometimes in order to impose the liberal economy, free market economy, and not, and we should not reach the conjunction like, some sort of self-destruction of neoliberalism, I think, if that's what you mean. On the other question, I understand the European Stability Mechanism as an institution similar to the IMF, because it is a fund for states that go bankrupt, and they take loans under specific conditions, as it happened with Greece, Portugal, and others. And somehow it works a little bit like the IMF. It has this character of punishing countries in the sense that to get the loans, you really have to promote specific reforms like privatization, liberalization, shrinking of the public sector, and so on. And from the whole financial crisis in the Eurozone, maybe this institutional step was important, because even now in the pandemic, it seems that everything should go through the mechanism of the ESM. Maybe we could you could comment later on that. As to the other speakers, I would like to comment on Margaret. She argues that the coronavirus aid package benefits mainly the big corporations, and I think she's absolutely right here. And maybe this explains how is it possible that we read at the newspapers that the investors, the stock markets, they are all very optimistic. And I ask myself, how is this possible with such a great recession that we're having? And maybe that's the reason, because they have received so much money out of this, and which is not the case for the social majority, of course, who face and are going to face, because I don't think it has really started yet, the consequences. They are going to face so many hardships and so many problems. For example, the ILO speaks of a lost lockdown generation, including all these people, especially young people working in precarious jobs, informal economy, the gig economy, and so on, who they have so much difficulties to enter the labor market, to avoid precariousness and all this. And of course, at least here in Greece, there are so many small and medium-sized enterprises that are closed for 1 year, and we all know that many of them will never reopen. And so what happens to this new unemployment? The ILO reports that thousands of working hours have been lost. New people, a new population of unemployed people, the so-called, who are totally inactivated with no entrance to the labor market and so on. And so, yes, I agree with that point of Margaret about the asymmetries of who is benefiting and who is not. As to the many important and interesting questions raised by Michael, I just wanted to comment on the state, because for a book we have edited, me, Gareth Dale, and Christopher Holmes, for example, Michael has written the afterword, and there you write that Polanyi offers a Hegelian or a Durkheimian view of the state as an expression of homogeneous interests. And you're also to point one reading of Polanyi. Of course, we noted other readings as well. And now you say that we need a state, and that is the only institution or set of institutions that accomplish the extension of time horizons is the state. You're right. So, I mean, we have to bring the state back again somehow. It hasn't been back since the 70s, or the Marx state debate and so on. It seems that somehow this debate has to start again because of these state interventions that we have now. You say we need a state that expresses broad social interests, and okay, I agree with that, but we haven't seen such a state in the last decades, or perhaps we have never seen such a state. And I'm thinking that the crisis of the 70s and the crisis of 2008 both have been resolved to the detriment of social income and the working classes. So I don't feel we have reasons to hope that this time will be different. We somehow have to always remember it is a capitalist state, and we cannot dream too much about social democracy on the national level, or even a European Keynesianism, whatever. So, yes.
Thank you to Michael and Maria. I think, a lot of your presentations raised some questions. I want to first touch upon something, Michael, that you said about these counter movements, and I'll speak a little later about it again. But I think, when we think about it, most of these counter movements really do have to do with notions of inequality and injustice. Many of them, even if it's not always, it's a perception, right? Whether it's a right-wing or progressive politics of how that framing happens, and a divide between what they think the state is doing and also the relationship between states, corporations, and society. And I think we're going to have to spend a lot more time, and I don't have an easy answer to this, thinking about how we address the issues of these deep inequalities, right? And how the new platforms also land up with the kind of information and the kind of misinformation they provide, lend to certain kinds of counter movements, whether the right or the left, right? Coming to your, the point about, Maria, you talk about the state, but also about the pandemic. I just want to kind of bring this idea of joblessness. I tend to agree with both of you, and many of it, especially the context of the state, and perhaps we'll talk a little more later about it. But in the US, just for example, even the divide between labor and corporations, right? The US, we lost 22 million jobs once the pandemic started. And many of these, while some have been recovered, it really is those who are doing the difficult jobs, the disproportionate amount of it is by people of color, and minorities have lost these jobs. And so we just have to, I think there's, to me, most of this idea, even in the Polanyian sense of counter movements, really has to do with inequality, economics, the economics of it, right? And how the state plays out, and how labor is addressed, and how those come together. And, I think we'll speak a little more in the next session, next question about it. I also have to tell you, Michael, you bring about Biden, and I want to sound optimistic. I'm not sure that I am in that place, just reading today's newspaper and, what it's going to take, even in terms of, the issue of green emissions and what kind of alliances are going to be made with corporations that will actually, and labor, and what the implications of that are. Maria, I just want to say, I actually agree with you on what you shared, but I really think that the state has to be rethought, what we mean by the state, not just about democracy, but I think what we mean by the state and what form the state will take in the future.
Thank you very much for this first round. Michael, do you want to respond to Maggie? Yes? Maggie
and Jeff Goodwin, and on this question, well, Jeff asked about the class dynamics. That's tough. The class dynamics of the current wave of marketization and the influence on contemporary counter movement activity. So I'm responding also to Margaret. I always thought somehow the appeal of Polanyi is that he shifted the source of struggle movements from the idea of exploitation to the idea of commodification. And my own view was that actually in the contemporary period, working class struggles have diminished. It has become increasingly a privilege to be a member of the stable working class with the rise of precaritization. And that has gone along with what I argued rather, I think, provocatively, unfortunately, well, perhaps fortunately, that the working class has not really been a major actor. And the movements that we saw from 2010 onwards were, well, we're talking about Arab Spring, Indignados, Occupy. Somehow these were movements that were perhaps in part shaped by precaritization, but largely as well, Margaret's been talking about movements around inequality or social justice. And I think that is the case. Now, the question is, what's that to do with commodification? So there may, I'm just wondering whether we have to, whether I feel that in fact, even the idea of commodification does not help us necessarily adjust to the sorts of movements we've seen in the United States. And that what working class movements have we seen here? We've seen movements of teachers, embryonic movements of teachers, Sometimes nurses, there's been the attempts, for example, at unionizing Amazon, a disaster. Of course, it's not surprising that it was a disaster. I mean, there's a whole history of disasters of trying to organize a place like Amazon because the power is with capital. This doesn't look good from my point of view of a sort of working class struggles as such. At this point in time, though you might say in the New Deal in the United States, it was actually the development of the New Deal that sort of encouraged the development of trade unions. So that might yet be in store for us, But yeah, so I'm not got a very good answer to your question, Jeff, but I know that you're very insistent on bringing capitalism into the analysis of social movements. And I think we're all on board for that. And that Polanyi definitely leads us in that direction.
Thank you very much. You are all talking about social movements. Maria and Maggie, do you want to add something to this question? If not, then I would go to our second round. Yes, we have seen that it's very important if we want to understand the pandemic and the crisis now to have insights in the decade before. But now we want to come to the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis. And I would like to ask you three to detail your analysis on the crisis and to answer questions like, do the effects of the pandemic, in particular the economic crisis, let us expect a backlash concerning labor disputes, collective bargaining, emancipatory movements? Maggie already talked about it a little bit. And in how far do the increasing influence of right-wing populism and forms of state interventionism put democracy at risk? And in how far are we witnessing a crisis of neoliberalism and market fundamentalism or attempts to consolidate them again? So it's of interest for all of us, I think, to have now a much more detailed analysis of the contemporary development and the COVID-19 pandemic. Who wants to start?
Maria, do you want to start or?
Okay. So to all these questions, I would like to focus or start with the question of democracy, and note that for the last year first lockdown, there have been some surveys that are published, and they show a strong social consensus to the lockdown decided by states. For example, a study in 15 EU countries finds that trust in government and vote intentions for the party in office have increased, and surveys for Southern Europe found that citizens supported the trade of individual liberties for COVID state protection. Of course, these studies emphasize that this consensus was temporary, but still it was a consensus, although it is declining in the second and third lockdowns across Europe. Another study, which I think is interesting, calls us to think again about the role of fear in politics, not in the sense that fear is something that is always cultivated by the state from above, but also a social emotion that states have to respond to. So even if we accept that mutuality and that fear was the reason for the social compliance to the lockdown measures, which have shrunk individual freedoms in favor actually of a police state, the question for democracy is whether governments will aspire to take advantage of this consensus to impose possibly a more permanent form of authoritarianism. For instance, it is not only China's police state or Israel's surveillance techniques. Also in France, there were police intimidations. In Spain, the military was out at the streets. And in Hungary, a bill was passed for Orban to rule by decrees. In Greece, the government did not hesitate to pass laws while the society was locked in. For instance, a law to have police forces inside the universities to police what they call delinquent students. Of course, this is an unprecedented law, but a demonstration against it was quickly repressed by the police with the argument that gatherings were forbidden due to COVID. Then the opponents of this university police law, they tried to organize, they arranged some Zoom meetings and they made YouTube videos to post on Facebook and so on. But the effects were limited as these videos got lost somehow in the millions internet videos. A second danger for democracy has to do with the description of COVID by politicians as an so-called unpredictable or invisible enemy. Similar enemies of the past were the terrorists since 2001 who were said to attack anywhere, anytime, or during the 2008 financial crisis, the invisible global market speculators who were said able to attack an entire national economy. And so in these cases, politicians use a language of war without much explanation of how and why this enemy was born. And then a scenario of war takes place and so-called responsible subjects are required. For example, in a study for Greece that me and a colleague have done, we analyzed 46 announcements in the television by the team that designed the lockdown, consisting of both medical experts and government officials, who for about 2 months, every day at 6 o'clock, they announced lockdown measures. The words this lockdown team has used were, for example, invisible enemy, common enemy, unpredictable enemy, nightmare enemy, war with COVID, universal war, final battle, battle with darkness, and so on. And against all that, they requested individual responsibility, as they called it, and this was heard more than 120 times during these press releases. Also, there were the so-called responsible ones who stayed home versus the irresponsible ones who were caught by the police outside without a reason. For the former, the officials on TV said, "We are proud of the responsible citizens," and for the latter, there were punishment threats. So the question is, what kind of responsibility is required in the COVID era? Polanyi advocated responsibility, but only when it came from democratic participation to economic policy and the overview of production, as he called it. But the responsibility against COVID is that of individualistic subjects to secure alone their existence in a social setting of deregulated welfare institutions. Then we also observe an interlocking in the emerging COVID capitalism between international health organizations, governments, pharmaceutical companies, global financial institutions, and the police. We seem to be somehow at the zenith of a Foucauldian biopolitical model in which economic, political, medical, and policing powers are all merged together. Governmental decisions are attributed to medical experts, but medical experts are also taking into account aspects of the economy and of policing. For example, the Greek medical expert of the lockdown commission stated, "We need a delicate balance between social and economic effects." And that's something we would expect from a politician, not from a doctor. And conversely, the political expert stated the reason we lock down the society is a medical reason. So, I mean, democracy is threatened when it is not clear who exactly decides and with what criteria, and the only clear thing is the need to obey the measures, even if these measures are contradictory. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I want just to add a comment from Francisco Bozzano Barnes. The presence of the army in Spain was supported by the left coalition government and found bodies in retirement pensions that had been abandoned to die. Just to inform all about this comment. So the next one around would be Maggie, I think.
Okay. Maria, I want to start by saying that, Maria, you make some important points about the state and the state of fear, what has been built up and how this plays out. And, I'm not going to focus on it today, but you see, as I spend more in terms of counter movements and looking at the US, but you clearly see during this pandemic, the way democracy has been ended in many parts of the world, really. You see counter movements. I mean, I'm not going to spend too much detail on India, but India is another place where you see how the state, right, has accrued certain kinds of power during the lockdown, and the nature of how that power is used and how it has led to the poor and the disenfranchised experiencing much of the problems, right? While you still have corporations actually doing pretty well. And you see this in, just the movement of people, as you saw those images in the early period of time of literally thousands and thousands of people trying to, without food, trying to get back to the rural areas and what that meant in terms of a pandemic, understanding once again the kind of inequalities that exist, workers not being able to come in, workers being stranded in parts, states being closed, right? Borders being closed that did not allow that kind of movement and rendered large numbers of people displaced. And this, so I kind of wanted to say that before I moved. I mean, clearly we have to think of the backlash or the formation or the strengthening of governments that may have called themselves democracies to becoming more and more authoritarian, and in the guise of this benevolent father, who then, is doing this for the good of the nation, and how this, the state then exercises the kind of power and oppression. Of course, then you see the counter movements, and I won't talk about it here because I am trying not to kind of bring in different ones, but the farmers, the farmers' protests in India is an amazing, amazing example of counter movements trying, right, to address how the state colluded with capital and with corporations, right, to bring about a way that took away from the rights of farmers, and in a movement which actually was a phenomenal counter movement, while it, to try and see that they could shift and pressure the government to revise some of the kind of laws they were trying to put during democracy. So, this whole question about democracy, we really have to think about how that plays in a pandemic and how it allows for almost a state of emergency under which you don't have to do much to justify the control and power that you exercise. So I want to come back to, as I've been talking about counter movements, although the Polanyian double movement is not sufficient to explain the transformation of contemporary capitalism, I actually think the concept is useful to understand contemporary counter movements as a reaction on the societal experience of the dynamics of the finance market-driven economy. Although proponents of the free market have held sway for a long time, current social movements and protests are a sign of growing resistance, at least to the social crisis, but maybe also to the systemic aspects within market-driven capitalism and its neoliberal governance that have exacerbated inequalities through structures of injustice. And we've seen this. Brigitte and I have written a paper earlier, but I think this is connected to the pandemic too. Even in this global pandemic, the finance market-driven economy and its dominance over the society has spawned asymmetry and discord with great wealth disparities and social inequalities. The pandemic in many ways highlights the historical, structural, and relational dimensions of domination and oppression that underlie the current conditions of inequality and injustice. It also shows to us how local conditions are shaped by globalization, privatization, and market-driven changes in the context of land, labor, and livelihood. And we actually see this happening in kind of real time during the pandemic. What does it mean for labor? What kind of movements are involved? How is land being treated? And what is the notion of whose livelihood is being looked into by the state or by any other entity? The complex economic, social, political, and racial injustices is also seeing the rise and persistence of protest movements. This emerging counter movement demands structural changes and pressures the state to be accountable and address inequalities and injustices. But the question that we have to ask, is the state really ready or equipped to handle this? And we have yet to see. We have seen it, in fact, very often take a very authoritarian turn. The growing protest movements for accountability, reform, and structural change have the potential to build into a much larger and sustained counter movement for social justice and transformation. In the United States and nationwide, the Black Lives Matter protests have demanded structural transformation. The counter movement is seen by the mobilization of Black Lives Matter protests all over the country, addressing police brutality. The prison industrial complex, which is really, if you look at historically, really has also been a part of corporate capital, right? Of corporations seeking money and privatization. This mobilization, coalition building, they've mobilized to build unity and solidarity to fight for economic, racial, and social justice, right? Where class and race and economics and politics and social justice all kind of come together. This mobilization, coalition building, and organizing through protest movements against marketization, liberalization, and the failure of the state can be considered a counter movement, which attempts to put pressure on the government for equality and justice through legislation and implementation of public policies and practices for social justice and structural transformation. So, Michael mentioned the idea of unions, and of course, one hopes that unions will do much, but you look at other forms, right, of solidarities and organizing that come to be, and the question will be, can they be sustained? Similarly, gender justice movements and social justice movements are attempting to do so by drawing attention to intersectionality and issues with implications for social justice for all, and can be considered as counter movements. These counter movements have brought together people and participants of various justice movements to highlight injustices, including issues such as reproductive rights, gender and intersectional violence, migrant rights, labor rights, citizenships, right to science, environmental justice, and the need to address the spectrum of issues of injustice that frequently intersect. And even during the pandemic, when they were locked down, there were other ways in which this was being continuously done on different platforms, but also by actually coming together in peaceful protests. Black Lives Matter and immigrant rights movements are participating in building alliances within the civil rights movement in upholding voting rights, freedom to worship without intimidation or harassment, freedom of speech, the importance of the rights of indigenous people. They've also drawn attention to the need to halt the pipeline of school to prison and make the state accountable to revamp the criminal justice system that has prioritized profit over people through privatization of prisons. They've fought against police brutality and talked about the need to address issues of racial justice. They have talked about defunding of police and how the state and corporations play into all this. It has also meant fighting and uniting to end the various restrictions that stop previously incarcerated people from voting, living in public housing, and to also work productively to ensure policies and practices of reintegrating into society. Workers' rights and economic justice are also important in counter movement against privatization and marketization. Increasingly, there are attempts to reinvigorate unions in the US to address the pernicious aspects of the gig economy, even while corporations promote and push individualization. Both of you have talked about this. I think the question really is, can the unions in their current traditional unions play the roles that they did? And one will have to think about that. We clearly saw the Amazon union as a disaster. It includes a need for us to draw attention and consider paths and possibilities to protect workers' rights, the problems of criminalization of poverty, and seeking an end to homelessness and baseless evictions. There have been protest movements and advocacy for the equal right and the protection of natural resources from privatization and market-driven or corporate exploitation. So for me today, there's a growing counter movement that includes multiple movements. It's not one movement, it's not one major movement, it's many movements intersecting, such as women's movements, anti-violence movements, civil rights movements, police reform movements, environmental justice movements, progressive movements, and also right-wing movements. There is an increasing attempt by progressive movements to address both specific issues as well as their intersections, and to work through coalition building, through dialogue, through debate and action. For many, the rise of the right, the onslaught of capitalism, marketization, a global elite who use economic and political social systems to amass wealth and safeguard and expand their power, has increased the urgency to bring forth a strong counter movement that ensures social justice and social change. The pandemic allows us to think about it. I'm not sure what form it will take in the long run and whether it'll be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I would like to include now comments and questions, and you may make a decision who will answer. The next, of course, is Michael with his statement, but we can perhaps take the questions and comment with us. First, Aman Banerjee. Beyond the reproduction of neoliberalism via state policy in this moment, I wonder if the panelists see the hegemonic common sense ideas of neoliberalism and its centering of market as being challenged in the public consciousness today. Could this express a dimension of rupture with neoliberalism, or does the failure of the state portend perhaps an even deeper faith in the market and a renewed restructures neoliberalism? That's the question. A comment from John Tronto, just to add a footnote to Margaret's analysis, are the rights of domestic workers and other marginalized women workers. And a question from Francisco Bozzano Barnes: how can the system buy itself out of the crisis and avoid a crisis in a pay time? These are the comments and questions, and the next one for the statement is Michael.
I'm sorry, I don't really have a statement, but I do have something to state. In fact, this question by Aman Banerjee, that's a really interesting question, whether the pandemic has actually shifted people's consciousness. And, you have to look at this again, state by state. One's tempted to generalize from one's experiences, and I'm sitting here in Oakland, California. But, in the United States, you might, specifically in the United States, you might argue that that the Biden administration, with his attempt, has actually, today I heard the figures that 40% of the population, I guess it must be adult population, has received at least one jab of one of the vaccinations, and it's a bigger percentage than any other country in the world, they say. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard. But it is in any case pretty high. So the question is, there are the anti-vaxxers, there are people, and that's going to be the problem from now on, to get everybody vaccinated, or 70% of the population vaccinated. But yes, I think it's a very interesting question as to whether this has shifted the consciousness and the disposition towards the market, and whether the state has actually validated itself. And perhaps this again may be a reaction to this sort of the anti-state politics of Trump, the deep state. And it is an extraordinary story that Trump didn't actually make further inroads than he actually made. He was a pretty frustrated authoritarian leader. Well, he would be pretty frustrated under all circumstances, I guess. But anyway, there were real limits to what he could do, and it did suggest a resilience to what we call US democracy. Limited democracy though that may be. But anyway, it's an interesting question. What I was going to raise, and I'm glad that we are being self-conscious here about the countries we are talking about, and that Margaret was actually talking about India. But what is the story about the pandemic? You actually look at the authoritarian regimes around the world. It seems that in those countries, the pandemic is now really taking off in an uncontrollable way. If we're going to think of the Modi regime as a form of authoritarianism, India is sort of leading the race at the moment for increases and then we can think of Brazil, Philippines, Turkey. These are the countries where the pandemic is really taking off at this point. So it's interesting that an interesting question as to why authoritarian regimes might be less successful. One might, on the other hand, look at China, and one might look at Russia, where, if we are to believe figures, and of course that's always difficult, but there's a sort of that the pandemic has been more limited. So it's not as if it's just authoritarianism. I mean, it may have something to do with also the issue of poverty. There was I heard an interesting talk not so long ago about the pandemic in India and how the three injunctions that Indians are supposed to pursue: shelter in place, distancing, and wash your hands. I mean, it's probably for half the population, it's just, or 3/4 of the population, just impossible. I mean, to do social distancing. So it's not surprising that that some countries are now suffering more than others. But it's an unfathomable variation as far as I can tell. I mean, if you look at across Africa, some countries have hardly any cases, or very few cases, and other countries more. I mean, South Africa is an interesting puzzle too, has been up and down. Yeah, we've got a lot to learn. And the role of the state may be, of course, a factor in this. But I just want to end on one point. I mean, if any phenomenon shows the importance of globalization, surely it's the pandemic. That's what everybody's now getting scared about. That we may be able to sort of increase the vaccination rate even in the United States, but if it's going to accelerate with new mutations in India, in Brazil, then we're not going to be protected against it. They're going to hit us. So we got to think about the global context of which this is taking place, and that's a sort of, I suppose, a Polanyi perspective. How does one think about developing institutions like the WHO with a sort of an executive arm to it? And would that mean the rise of authoritarianism? I mean, can we think of some sort of global quote counter movement without thinking of the rise of some sort of global authoritarianism? And if working off on Maria's point, I mean, the power of corporate capital in that context, what would that mean for the global authoritarianism? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Maria and Maggie, do you still want to add something in this round?
Yeah, I'll just do this briefly. I think the question that Iman asked is very important. I actually do believe that between the different platforms and media, etc., that you may have a situation where the state, as you say, put in perhaps or even deeper faith in the market, but it means neoliberalism can get restructured. We don't know, but in what way, what form it takes. I actually want to come back also to Michael's point, because I'm glad we talk about context and the global aspects, and we can talk about all these different countries. And as you mentioned, the WHO, I just want to quickly take a moment. Today's New York Times had this piece. I run the WHO, and I know that rich countries must make a choice. Dr. Tedros talks about it as one of the issues, and this kind of comes back to capital, right? The reality that, what we have once again is global corporate capital, right? Accumulating masses of money and the distribution, the problems of distribution of vaccines. And so I'm going to just kind of quote why, and the title is, "If they keep their vaccine promises, the pandemic can end." Now, I mean, I have a lot of problems with the WHO, but let's talk about the fact that what was committed in terms of vaccine distribution. And if you look at it, he mentions, what are some of the reasons for this kind of inequality and what's happening in the double talk of corporations while they, talk about vaccines have been actually, and states how states have also been, nations been doing a double talk, where they have been accumulating vaccines and not, and so I'm going to quote, says first, vaccine nationalism has weakened COVAX, with a handful of rich countries gobbling up the anticipated supply as manufacturers sell to the highest bidder, while the rest of the world scrambles for scraps. Some countries have placed orders for enough doses to vaccinate the entire population several times over, promising to share only after they have used everything they need, perpetuating the pattern of patronage that keeps the world's have-nots exactly where they are. So, I mean, I think it's important. We can talk about national success and we can talk about Biden, achieving certain goals, but it's at what cost? And what is the kind of collusion between state and capital and corporate capital? So I just wanted to kind of bring that point that we really have to think about these things, not just in terms of the nation state, but also within the global context.
Thank you very much. Maria, is it possible that we combine this round with the next round and you open the next round? Because we only have 12 minutes and I would like to discuss the next point. The next round would be whether the pandemic can be seen as a possible turning point towards alternative ecological, economic, social, and political pathways, whether the pandemic can be understood as a chance to break with the market fundamentalism and the destructive commodification of land, labor, and money and knowledge, as Michael already had added. So are there emancipatory potentials we can see at the moment? And I would like to ask Maria to start. We have 11 minutes and then we have to shut the session. So each one, 3 or 4.
Okay. One of the most important problems that COVID has brought to surface is that of healthcare privatization. A priority of the state in the last decades has been to open up and empower private healthcare markets, and together with low taxation, another way the state used for this purpose was to underfund, to understaff, and to degrade the public healthcare system, and even ideologically persuade voters about its very low social utility. But now, on the contrary, COVID has shown the private sector's low social utility. For instance, at least in Greece, you pay to take the COVID test in private health centers, but if you are a COVID patient, you have to wait in the queue of a public hospital, as private hospitals refused to help in the COVID emergency, and they do not accept COVID patients because their treatment in a possible intensive care unit is more expensive. Of course, doctors have protested and criticized the government for trying to impose silence on the situation in public hospitals and for trying to protect the private sector by closing the door to COVID patients. They have reported threats, intimidations, dismissals, and so on. Thus, what was needed before COVID and after COVID is the reversal of this privatization trend for the empowerment of the public sector and equal access to healthcare. However, it seems that the police and surveillance state rather than the welfare state is strengthened, and perhaps the social right to get protected is used as the basis for authoritarianism, while business and privatization return gradually to their neoliberal so-called normality. And on these authoritarian aspects of the pandemic management, some bizarre contestation came from some new up to now limited political forces consisting of far-right, internet bloggers, COVID deniers, conspiracy theories, and so on. Therefore, a new rise of the far-right can result either from austerity and anti-labor legislation imposed after the bailouts, or by state authoritarianism, censorship, police oppression, or both. Selected epidemiologists and state officials promoted their solutions, but the social dimensions have been undermined in the public discourse. For instance, the decline in the GDP of public healthcare expenditure in many countries in the previous decades, the low wages and low labor precarity for health workers, the imposition of technocratic and economistic new public management logics, and so on. And there was little concern about the pandemic inequalities that both Michael and Margaret described so good, so I will not describe. So to come to Brigitte's question, what has to be done by emancipatory movements, and any such movements cannot simply demand some more state, and the state has to be reconsidered once again. What has made various politicians who advocated neoliberalism to implement policies that they opposed? For instance, the Greek Prime Minister, who was an advocate of market supremacy, managed to get elected by saying, "I'm not promising government spending," and some months later, he had to increase spending. Of course, he did not change his ideology so quickly, neither have done so the European leaders who declared the COVID state of emergency. Today's state interventions can be understood if we turn to Polanyi. What he called the 19th century protectionist movement for him hampered and restricted trade, as he said, and we could say the same for the lockdown in our days. For Polanyi, it was not that leaders around the world had suddenly decided to get rid of capitalism as advocates of what he called anti-liberal conspiracy thought. But this protectionist movement was due to what Polanyi called objective reasons of a stringent nature, he said, in order to assist capitalism. He underlined that capitalism was never capable to simply reproduce itself and always necessitated a strong state on its side. Thus, we cannot suddenly forget how states operated in the last decades and in the financial crisis, and we cannot, or I'm not sure if we cannot trust or be convinced by today's state's intervention, for it remains a capitalist state, of course, and because of the pandemic, obeys to what Polanyi called objective reasons of a stringent nature. We know that in the pre-COVID era, the minimal state existed only as regards welfare for lower classes, but there existed generous welfare for the upper classes. So the question for the post-COVID era is to what degree this can be reversed and how exactly. And I stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we are in the concluding remarks. I regret this very much, but we have few minutes, 2 for Michael and Maggie for each.
I will, I think I disagree. I think Maria's put it very well and has, put some of the issues. I just have a minute where I will say, I must confess at this point in time, I'm not as hopeful. I'm not sure. I have more questions than answers. The post-pandemic can be a chance for change, especially with the young generation committed to a more just and sustainable world. However, I must admit that while I hope that this is the case, I'm not sure what this will take. To me, the question is, will the markets morph into new mediums for capital accumulation and exploitation or commodification of labor? Will we see which Maria has already talked well about, will we see increasing privatization of healthcare? Will we see technology and new platforms owned by corporations change the way we live? As for the shape of democracy, one may have to think what this means in a world of surveillance. I don't know if Polanyi has all the answers here, but I think we can apply some of the concepts that he spoke about. I'll end by saying, can the energies and the will of a new generation committed to equality and justice be the movers to a more equal, just, and sustainable world for all, where they question both the state and corporations? Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Michael?
Okay. Well, yes. So since Maria and Margaret are ending on an optimistic note, I better do the same. When I think of emancipation, I think of Eric Olin Wright's Real Utopias. And as I think about them, what were they? Wikipedia, public banks, cooperatives, basic income grants, Those are the ones that are off the top of my head. And basically, they're all about decommodification. They're really all about, in a sense, constituting a world, a non-market world. They're all about decommodification. And the question I would have then is, in the pandemic, in the sort of responses in civil society, have there developed new forms of organization and institutions that sort of go along with these emancipatory projects that Eric talked about, that endorse the idea of there is an alternative to an unregulated marketization? Finito.
Yes, and that's good to finalize it there. Thank you very much for all of you for contributing to this conversation. And thank you very much to all of you, the participants, who have contributed the comments and the questions. And I think it has been an interesting conversation about the time before, in, and I hope after the pandemic, and perhaps there are some opportunities to discuss in the networking session in Wonderland with our new technology, and perhaps you can continue all these discussions in Wonderland then. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.